Hello, everyone, and welcome to Radio Socialist Olympia, the podcast of the Olympia chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. I'm Isaac Wagnitz. We're joined today by Syd Locke, longtime Olympia DSA member who was our endorsed candidate for Washington State House of Representatives in Legislative District 22, which covers the Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater area, where he was running against Olympia City Council member Lisa Parsley. Syd joined a number of DSA candidates who ran in state and local races around the country. Although sadly Syd did not win his race, he won what I consider an impressive 1/3 of the vote, given that he was a first-time candidate with less name recognition and campaign money than his opponent. It's worth noting a number of DSA-endorsed candidates across the country did win on November 5th, including Sean Scott from Seattle, who will become the first socialist in the Washington State Legislature in about 100 years. Hi, Syd, and welcome to the program.
Hey, Isaac. Good to be here.
Thanks. First off, tell us a bit about yourself. What is your background, both professionally and in terms of political involvement? How did you first get involved in activism or organizing, and what caused you to join DSA?
Well, as far as my professional experience, I've worked at the legislature in both the House and the Senate for Democratic legislators for over 30 years. I was a Bernie Sanders delegate in 2016. Before that, I was involved in politics. Like, I was excited about the Jesse Jackson campaign back in the 80s. So I'm 66 years old, so I've been around the block a few times. And I've been a member of Olympia DSA for a few years, since about 2019, I think. And I've always had a commitment to having people have their economic needs met, including healthcare, housing, education, higher education, and all the civil rights, and looking at these economic rights as human rights, and not just as something like expensive commodities that people can barely afford or can't afford at all. So I am a democratic socialist. I've worked at the legislature for Democratic legislators. I've always been on the very left side of the Democratic Party, so to speak. I don't really feel like I always fit there, but probably Bernie Sanders doesn't always feel like he fits there either.
All right, yeah. And I just want to say, I whenever I was talking with people about your campaign, I tried to remind them, I swear every time I went to any kind of a picket line, Syd was there, it seemed like, and I've gone to a few myself, so that I think is a point in your favor for sure.
Yeah, I helped get collective bargaining rights for legislative employees. I was a leader in that because legislative employees, we didn't have collective bargaining rights until just recently. And the legislature would always kind of exempt themselves from labor rules, labor laws. But we got that accomplished. I'm really proud of that. And I've always had a big commitment to organized labor, because the working class is the key to transforming society.
Absolutely. So what was it that ultimately made you decide to run for office, and why this office in particular?
Well, actually, it was, I never really thought I was going to run for office, because I don't feel like that was really my path. But I got so upset about the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and the legislature ignoring it. And even though there was huge demonstrations at the Capitol with a few thousand people demonstrating, coming from all over the state, on weekends and on weekdays even, and they didn't do anything. They do things on foreign policy. They had, for instance, House Joint Memorial about Ukraine, But when it came to Gaza, there was silence because it was happening under a Democratic administration, the Biden administration. And the state legislature in Washington state is controlled by Democrats in the House and the Senate and the governor's office. So I remember the day that Senator Patty Murray, came to the legislature to visit and kind of report on what's happening federally and how it relates to Washington State and how the state legislature can work together with the federal government and so forth. And I asked one of the legislators who was there in the caucus, I said, did anybody ask Senator Murray about Gaza, or did she mention Gaza at all? Did she mention Palestine? And he paused for a second and he said, no, that didn't come up. And I just felt so disgusted. That's when I decided that I was going to run. And, I don't know if it was, probably in hindsight, I would recommend that if you're going to run for office, you need to start early and organize early. And mine was I just felt compelled that I had to. And it wasn't probably early enough, and that probably didn't help me as far as running a campaign. But I'm glad that I did do it because everyone knew that I was going to be a voice speaking up, opposing the genocide. And I think that made an impact with the voting public, positively or negatively sometimes. So, but it did distinguish me as a candidate.
So on the subject of tactics, there was some debate early on in the campaign within your team about whether to go for the Senate seat that was opened up by Sam Hunt's recent retirement, the longtime senator from LD-22, versus one of the House seats, and what finally sealed that decision for you?
Well, because I be running as a Democratic Socialist, and I would always never try and hide that fact. And I had that on my voters pamphlet, on my literature, my doorbelling piece, so forth. And I knew that the best chance of winning would be have a crowded Democratic field and one Republican in a race. And I thought we were going to have that in the Senate, for the Senate race, because there was a Republican who filed with the Public Disclosure Commission. And there were, including myself, 4 Democrats who were running for that Senate seat. So I figured I could take the left lane, get all the Bernie people, get the socialists and lefties, and the other Democratic candidates would split the centrists and the conventional Dems. And I would advance against the Republican because I think that I could have gotten about a third of the vote. Turns out that was a pretty good estimate. And Republicans had always filed for office in the 22nd District before. And they usually got like between, say, 31 and 35%. So if they got a third and I got a third, and there's another 3 candidates in the race who were dividing up the centrist Democrats, I felt like my odds of advancing against a Republican were good. And if I advanced against a Republican to the general election, then I would get all the centrist Democrats to vote for me in the general because they wouldn't want to vote for the Republican. Well, it turns out that even though there was a Republican who filed with the Public Disclosure Commission for that position and was marking down how much money they raised and everything, when it came to filing week, when you actually had to file for office with the Secretary of State's office, they didn't file, and they didn't file. You have 1 week to do that. And I was watching, and Monday went by, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday went by, and it got to be the last day, filing week. And it got to be the last hour of filing week, and still the Republican hadn't filed, and I had to make a decision what am I going to do? There was also no Republican who filed in the House seat either. So my whole strategy was kind of down the tubes. But I had been, campaigning and putting in the effort so far, so I didn't feel like I wanted to bail on that effort. I did want to run, and I wanted to at least get the message out about, economic rights, human rights, democratic socialist perspective, stopping a genocide, and so forth. So I decided to run for the House because I felt like I would probably, if I ran for the Senate, I would have to run against a well-funded Democrat in the general and an incumbent. Jessica Bateman was a very strong vote getter, and I just didn't feel like I probably could raise the kind of money to advance both in the primary election and then win in the general. I thought that was a pretty long shot. So I ran against Lisa Partially in the House. I figured that I could save some money and be competitive. It wasn't the ideal situation like I had outlined earlier, but that's how I decided to make that decision to run for the House.
Gotcha. Yeah, it was interesting that no Republican filed at all in either of those races, because historically they have, even though they never win them. Way back, I want to say it was like in 2016 when I worked on a few Democratic campaigns here locally. Someone with a lot more experience than I had in local politics was saying they thought that the Republicans run candidates here as like a practice, like they know they'll lose, but it's like they take inexperienced candidates and be like, this is how you do the thing, because they ran like a 19-year-old against Lori Dolan for like the state legislature. It was like kind of weird that year. But like with what you said, what were the key issues that you campaigned on in a field with no Republicans? What was your strategy to set yourself apart from your opponent when talking with voters, and moreover, what was your experience with voters at the doors like overall?
Yeah, well, like I mentioned earlier, I felt like there had to be a candidate. You needed elected officials at every level of government to speak out against the genocide. People were like, well, we can't really, it's not really our realm or whatever, and we're not going to do anything. But of course, they would say something about Ukraine. So that was one thing that I was going to distinguish myself as being one of the few candidates in the state who was going to campaign on that. And even though I was not running for Congress, I still thought it was important. And a lot of other people thought that was really important too. The other thing is universal health care as a right. So I was supported, and I was supported by Whole Washington, which is an organization that would want to get universal health care for, like a single payer health trust for everybody in Washington state, and get rid of the complicated and expensive healthcare system that we have now. I also was a big proponent of social housing. You can't leave housing to the just the private market. I felt like my opponent was always trying to just solve the problem by giving tax breaks and lesser regulations for private developers to build housing. And we've been doing that for a long time. And our housing situation is as bad as ever, worse than ever. So I felt like we needed to have social housing where the government can be involved. We can do our own bonding and get that out. So we have at least starting a segment where we could take that out of the speculative market. We would develop housing that would, say, permanently affordable. And also I was for rent stabilization and rent control, because rent is out of control. So we need to do something on that. And my opponent, my opponent did support some rent stabilization, kind of a watered down version of what Olympia for All proposed. And definitely she's opposed to rent control. So those are a couple of big things that that people were interested in. And I think people at the door really did respond to things like that. So yeah, I would stress, that this economic system it leaves everyone in precarious places. And people want stability. People want stability in their lives. And I was trying to say you need to design an economic system, an anti-capitalist, a socialist system that provides that stability for people and provides everything that they need, not just to survive, but to thrive. In fact, kind of our adopted political slogan was, we want bread, but we want roses too. Yes, we want the things, the bare necessities, the bread, but we also want the roses. We want the leisure time. We want the arts and music. We want a beautiful life. And I think that also resonated with a lot of voters.
Yeah, I think the unofficial DSA slogan that's simply "a better world is possible" is a good rallying point. You mentioned the issue of what's happening in Palestine being really central for you. I'm curious, how was that received at the doors? Because I heard, you always heard these, naysayers being like, oh, that's a turnoff for voters, or won't be able to relate it to people's material interests or whatever. But to me, it always seemed like pretty straightforward. It's like, for God's sake, like the amount of money that the U.S. government gives to Israel every year, you could do all kinds of social programming that would be of benefit to Americans. And I don't think it's unreasonable to prefer having your tax money spent improving this country rather than destroying another, right?
Exactly.
What was your experience with that, and did people kind of receive it in that way?
I did try and tie that back in exactly like you framed it. It was like, what could we do with all that money if we spend it trying to make people's lives better instead of using for death and destruction? And also because, I'm a socialist, I'm also internationalist, and we have to show international solidarity. So that's like a principle for me. But I did with the voters try and tie that in. And the kind of response I got was, some people were, I didn't have to say one word more for some people. They was like, that is, I'm going to vote for you for that. And other times, people would drive by and see me, and I'd have we'd be waving signs. We wave signs every weekday morning from like 7:30 to 8:30 in the morning, and we'd have our yard signs out with my name and with the rose on the sign and everything. But also, we would have signs that would have things like, universal health care, climate emergency, peace and justice for Palestine, ceasefire now. And, some people, when they saw that ceasefire now, they would flip me off. So it was people either loved it or they hated it. But I felt it was important as a socialist, as an internationalist, to highlight that. So I'm glad I did.
And out of curiosity, how many people do you think you talked to at the doors who just like weren't going to vote until they learned about your campaign and the stuff that you were talking about doing?
Well, I think, quite a few, but sometimes they say that and I'm not sure if they always follow through.
That's fair.
I mean, I'd have to, have a pretty sophisticated campaign to go back and try and track that. We did do some, phone banking and X banking and things like that, but I don't have the data to give you a firm answer on that. People said that they would, but, sometimes they say things that they don't follow through on. The other thing I did that was kind of unusual compared to a conventional campaign is that I would go into visit low-wage workers, whether it be in fast food or Walmart or places like that, and hand out my business card because we wanted to raise the minimum wage significantly. It's actually to $22 an hour. We wanted, I'd strongly support the Workers' Bill of Rights. That the campaign is happening in this area. And, these workers, their eyes would get wide as saucers, and they'd be excited about it. And sometimes the managers would run me out. I think I got some votes from them. But I don't have data to actually back that up. But that's the vibe I was getting. Yeah,
I just wanted to ask that because when Bernie Sanders ran in the presidential primaries and stuff, he had a lot of success. I mean, just in getting people to come out and vote who hadn't voted before, like didn't typically vote or weren't planning to vote just because they didn't feel represented by the system at all. Like nobody who was running was going to do anything for them. And yet, he was able to reach those folks. And I just personally, I think that is going to be, key for our strategy going forward. I mean, some of the stuff that I read about the November 5th election was that it's like, in absolute terms, Trump really didn't get any more votes than he did last time. It's just the Democrats got so many fewer, which implies that like a lot of people just got really alienated and didn't vote. And, whatever you think about that as in its, moral implications or whatever, it's like we have to get people to engage who haven't engaged before. It's like, when you talk about actually people's material interests in a way that, you can have that effect.
I completely agree. 2020 was the highest turnout, I think, in American history. But we need turnout like that to win. And Kamala Harris's totals were significantly lower than Joe Biden's in 2020. So that's really why she lost, is a lot of people stayed home.
Yeah. So as there were only two candidates in your race for the LD-22 House position, you advanced automatically from the primary in August to the general election in November, and you had a pretty similar vote share in both of them. And what do you think about your showing in this race? Because, I mean, I feel like in Olympia, every primary you get, oh no, the cat's coming to interfere with our operation here. Come on, sweetie, it'll be fine. Hazards of life. But in Olympia, it seems like every primary, there's always, some left-wing challengers who you've never heard about before, and it doesn't seem like they're very serious candidates. They get like 5 or 7%, but you got like 33% of the vote, right? Which is. She's dragging herself on the microphone.
No.
It's okay. And like, that's really impressive. I mean, you were a candidate who hadn't run for office before. You didn't have the name recognition that your opponent had. You didn't have as much money as your opponent had, but you got a third of the vote. After the primary, I actually saw on, streaming that Lisa partially did ads. Like, I had never seen anyone do ads in one of the local legislative races here before, which sort of implies that they were not taking it for granted, that they were a little worried, right, if they spent all that money on ads. I don't think they were very good ads, to be honest. But, so yeah, I mean, like, how do you feel about that? And in the future, I mean, like, what more do you think we really need to be doing to ensure victory for a future DSA candidate in this district?
Yeah, well, I was a candidate that I think people saw that I had experience as a staff person working in the legislature, but also that I saw that the system needed fundamental change, and it wasn't meeting people's needs. I felt probably by the time of all the votes are counted for the general, I'm going to get about 35%, and I got 33% in the primary. And I worked really, really hard before the primary, and then worked not nearly as hard for the general, and still got about the same. So I might be at the high water mark, just the way things are now, as far as, the local situation and the conditions as they are now. But what's interesting also is that in the Senate race, 2 Democrats advanced, and one was Jessica Bateman, who beat Bob Eall. Bob Eall only got like 26%, and he is a court commissioner. He's won races before. He is a business Democrat, and he is a tribal member. But I'm going to get almost 9 or 10% higher than Bob Eall. So there were the left-wing Democrats, or the left-wingers who voted for me, even if they might not be, Democrats. They seems like there was more left-wingers than there were like centrist business Democrats, by a significant margin. It's not like a complete cookie-cutter analysis, because we did have different opponents, but I think it's significant. It's a data point that we should pay attention to, that there is a left wing in the 22nd district. There are people who want fundamental change. I probably should have stressed fundamental change even harder, because I know a lot of people are just completely, even if they're not political, they know something needs to change. Mm-hmm. So, that's, we need to do, more field work and everything. I feel like we got close to the high water mark as far as campaign goes, and we got our message out, and so I would consider that a win.
Yeah, and I was just looking at the historical election results from 2020, when Mary Ellen Biggerstaff ran for the Washington State House. She was our endorsed candidate in that race. Longtime listeners may remember that interviewing her was one of the very first episodes of this podcast. And she was in a really crowded field. There was 5 candidates in that particular primary, and she only got about 13.5%. But, so I think that shows that we've been building our ability over time, to do this voter outreach and to message to people. So I'm personally am hopeful that if with more infrastructure, more planning, and more commitment of resources, that we could actually be winning races like this. I think I'm editorializing here a bit, but I think if we can really commit more financial resources, if we can devote more resources to, turning out, volunteers and donations for campaigns like this, we can actually win these things. I think you showed that it's not out of the question, right? A third is getting close to half. And, half is all, a little more than half is all you need to win a general election. On that note, there have been, I'm sure that there are many, comrades and many labor activists who probably thought about running for office or been encouraged to run for office, but have been daunted by the, enormous demands of energy. So I was sort of curious to hear, what your experience of running for office was like at a personal level, both the good parts and the bad, and also what you think organizations like DSA or like labor unions could be doing to make it easier for more working class people to run for office as we so desperately need.
Well, for labor unions, we need more DSA people to become higher ups in unions, and because, my experience with the labor unions is they were cautious. They didn't want to alienate the Democrats. They didn't want to alienate somebody who was favored to win. And so we need to have leftists be involved in leadership in whatever union that you're in. So that would be key, I think, because even though I was at every picket line for years that I helped organize the collective bargaining rights, I still did mediocre to poor as far as getting labor endorsements. My opponent pretty much got them all, almost all of them. I did get a co-endorsement from the Thurston Lewis Mason Central Labor Council. So that is important. The other thing is, like I mentioned, start early. Get a campaign manager. If you have volunteers, just you have to realize that they're volunteers and they're not like employees, so you can't depend on them like they're going to be there all the time. You have to be great at raising money, and so it's probably not my strong suit.
It's tough to ask for money.
It's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough to ask for money.
We can hear the cat purring on the microphone now. She's decided to be our friend while we record this.
So, just having a team that's dedicated and making that early start, and having a campaign manager.
Yeah.
Those are like some really fundamental pillars for a successful campaign. It's hard. It's hard, especially the first time, I guess. I haven't done it more than once. I just done it once. But, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's hard, and it's, an emotional roller coaster. And so just be prepared for that.
Yeah, I risk editorializing. Of course, that's kind of what the whole thing is. Why am I pretending? But, I think DSA should really, at least our chapter anyway, should really try to get members to contribute more money if they can, and we should actually, I think we should find a way to hire somebody part-time whose job it is just to turn people out for stuff. Like, for if we run a campaign again, it's somebody who can just be calling people to get them to show up to canvass, or if it's, something else, like to show up to city council meetings to talk about, things like the Workers' Bill of Rights or whatever. But it's like, you really have to have a certain amount of human time that you can rely on to do stuff like that, in addition to the candidate just doing, because God bless you, were out there, it seemed like every single day, and obviously not everyone can do that, but I think we need to, be able to like dedicate some resources to actually really turning people out and to actually just like planning these things ahead of time. Like, I think we need to be planning like 2 years out, to be like, this is a race we want to win in. Let's find somebody who we can count on to do it, and then make sure we can commit the resources to get them to win. Start, behaving more like a party at some level. I mean, when I worked on some Democratic campaigns in 2016, it's like, there was a paid campaign. I mean, granted, they had a lot more money, but they had, a paid campaign manager and a couple of like paid interns who it's like, okay, every weekday for a couple hours in the evening, you're going to go out and canvass and you'll knock out a precinct every night. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to ultimately be able to do. As for the getting union endorsements thing, and maybe we can talk about this more toward the end when we sort of talk about what we should be doing going forward. But I mean, there's an unfortunate paradox, which I understand. I mean, I'm a union member. I'm in a leadership position in my union. There is this, I think, concern about like backing challengers, because there's this worry that, if the challenger doesn't win, then the establishment person who gets through won't back us when we need it, or it's like we just don't want to commit, money and members' volunteer time to someone who we don't think we can win. So there's like this catch. Even if the challenger probably is the person who's going to be more reliably on your side if they do win, and probably would be more likely to win if unions supported them. So, I think, unfortunately, we have to prove that we're more capable of winning in order to get union endorsements for our candidates and stuff, which will then make it easier to win, right? And I'm hopeful that maybe with the really disappointing performance that the Democrats have had lately, that maybe labor will start looking for people who they can rely on a little more consistently to actually be really talking to working class people about their material concerns.
I think a good place to start is suggesting co-endorsements. If you feel like you can't actually win an endorsement for a leftist, like a DSA candidate, that if unions would bend and say, okay, we're going to co-endorse, I think that would be a start and be helpful. Oh, I don't know.
So at the kind of personal level, I mean, what was it about being on this campaign that made you feel like most hopeful or inspired? Sorry if that's a cliche, but I
did have a lot of people, even to the very end, saying thank you for running, and a lot of low-income people really loved our campaign. I mean, we talked to people who were like, they couldn't afford to go to the dentist. They couldn't barely afford rent, and talking to low-wage workers, it's a struggle. It's a real struggle, and just the fact that they were appreciative and maybe having some hope that they could get active politically. And elections is just one avenue. I think it's an important avenue, but it's just one avenue to getting people involved.
So, kind of in that light, I mean, how do you see your campaign in the context of the sort of broader political moment that we're having? And in terms of, what the election results have been up and down the ballot in this most recent general election. I mean, November 5th could be described really as a catastrophe at worst, and as a very mixed bag at best. I mean, with Donald Trump being back in the White House soon and Republicans having gained strength in Congress. But at the same time, a number of progressive and pro candidates and pro-worker ballot measures really came through at the state and local level. A number of states, didn't have paid leave and things like that, passed them. A number of DSA candidates won state and local office. How do you kind of see that context? That's not overly broad. Sorry.
It's a big question. I am encouraged by a lot of the ballot measures nationwide on, pro-choice, about raising the minimum wage, and so forth that passed. And I know for a fact that the Republican Party is not going to be able to deliver what all their voters think that they are going to be able to do. I'm pretty certain that we're going to have a major economic correction, like a 2008 style crash.
I love that euphemism, correction.
Yeah, right. Where people are going to be suffering, because Republicans don't have any answers. I mean, it's the same script. So I think that when we do have that crash, that for a lot of people anyway, the Republican Party will be discredited. There's some people who are just, kind of part of the Republican Party cult or the Trump cult, and they probably won't be moved. But I think a lot of people are going to be looking for answers. And with the Democrats, I think unless the Democratic Party really changes, which I don't see happening, but Bernie and some squad members prevail and moves the Democratic Party that way, then that could be an answer. But it might end up being a really hard work establishing a workers' party, a third party. So we'll see. But I don't think the next 4 years that some Republicans can provide any answers, and so people are going to be looking for something different.
Yeah, one encouraging thing, I suppose, is that there seems to kind of be a great equalizer in the fact that, any government that presides over a bad economy tends to get punished at the polls. A lot of other developed countries had elections recently, and pretty much all of the incumbents across the board, whether liberal or conservative, got hammered on by voters. Like the Tories got hammered on in Britain because they presided over, bad economy, high inflation, high cost of living.
I think in Mexico, the AMLO's party did well because they did campaign on a very progressive platform.
Well, yeah, they actually tried to do something.
So I think we should take lessons from that. We have to move left.
Yeah, and incidentally, this is just a thought that's kind of been going through my head, but it's interesting because, of course, as we know, under capitalism, especially under this very sort of deregulated neoliberalism, it's like the state really has little power oftentimes to control, the price of commodities, the cost of living. But what the wide discontent about that actually says is that in a way what people want is for the state to have more control over the economy, to be able to say, no, you're not going to charge people this much for, X, Y, or Z, which is in a way even if people would vigorously deny it, or I think in a way what people do want socialism, right? They want an economy that's more accountable to them, and I think that's something we can, if you'll forgive the term, capitalize on, right? We can say well, if you want the economy to be more responsive to your needs, it's we need to start changing how the entire system is set up.
Exactly.
Workers need to have more actual power over the economy.
Every year, every election year, it's the number one concern of voters is always the economy. And the slogan, it's the economy, stupid.
Wasn't that Bill Clinton, ironically enough?
Yeah. But it's true.
It was true, yeah.
And people want some stability and some hope that their lives are going to get better. And if Democrats are going to say, well, we can't do anything about it, we won't do anything about it, or we can't do anything about it, then if you can't do anything about it, then you need to change the whole system. If you won't do anything about it, you need to be kicked out, for sure.
So on the topic of the economy, something about your campaign that surprised me a little bit is that I saw way more than I expected, like actual small businesses having Syd Locke signs out in front of them. I wouldn't necessarily want to overstate the importance of that, but I think that it is encouraging to see, in the sense that anyone who's ever been to a city council meeting around here has seen business owners who are very reactionary, like show up to vent, about, the world will end if, we have to pay people a living wage or whatever. So it's encouraging to see that there is some segment of that, like, social stratum that actually see maybe some self-interest in having kind of a more equal economy, some more like social democratic policies. Mm-hmm. And also, as socialists, a sense pretty much forever have kind of grappled with the idea that the organized working class will have to win over like some segment of other classes, as the peasantry, small independent farmers, the petty bourgeoisie, that's, the small business class. Yeah. While not, sort of losing control of the whole thing, while the organized workers still maintain the leadership in those kind of movements. So I was just sort of curious, like, was there any like particularly consistent reason why some business owners wanted to support you, or that you heard, or
a restaurant that was a workers' co-op was an example. Also, businesses like Rainy Day Records, and a coffee shop that does a lot of evening music shows. Because, I did talk about this is part of sort of the whole bread and roses type of theme, that I wanted a vibrant art scene, vibrant music scene. So I did get people enthusiastic about that. And a lot of it has to do also with just making personal relationships with people. But I don't know if there's an exact formula that can translate for other campaigns. I'm just talking about my particular experience. So maybe there's something there that you can glean from.
I had to ask just because, like, in any sort of political debate that happens around here, there's always this discussion of, what's the impact it'll have on small businesses? And I think that's sort of frequently used as this sort of smokescreen to not do anything progressive. But the fact is that, I think even some small business owners like support, fairly, at least more progressive policies, and as we sort of think about the political terrain that we're on, a lot of has been made out of how much effort goes into like diluting the working class, about its self-interest. But I think that also holds true of like the small business class as well. I think that, reactionaries have done a good job of persuading them that their best interest somehow is reflected by whatever is good for like big capital. Like, you just have to crush the workers and keep them right down. But like when we had for my union, we had a stewards conference a couple years ago, and we had this labor historian come and talk about, he gave a really super, like in 30 minutes, like overview of the labor movement in the U.S. And he talked about that, like, when there were those big auto strikes in Detroit in the 30s, that a lot of the small business owners in the area, like, gave the striking workers discounts on stuff or like credit and stuff because they knew that if the workers held out and won the strike and won against, the big automakers and won, higher wages or whatever, they would have more money to spend. And so I was like, no, like, you don't have to believe even for a second that they were like being altruistic. It was just self-interest, but they understood that the workers actually doing better would have benefited them in turn. Also, I just was surprised more people don't raise that point when these discussions come up about, raising the minimum wage or having, predictable scheduling ordinances or whatever.
Maybe it's not widespread, but there are businesses who understand that when just everyday people have more money in their pockets, that they're going to be able to visit these small businesses and they're going to purchase something and it's going to help them. So I think there's some small business people who understand that there needs to be a middle class, if you will, is going to come downtown or come to their shops and be able to spend some money.
Yeah, fair enough. I know I'd rather spend my money at some place around here than have to go to, chain, big box chain stores or whatever. So moving on, I wanted to ask you some of the sort of specific policy type questions, since you were, of course, going to be our tribune in the state legislature. But I wanted to just ask sort of what your views were on some certain policy areas that seem to come up a lot in elections around here, like with the environment, for example. The environment's, gets talked about a lot in elections around here. It's a big concern for at least for some voters in our district. And with a good reason, right? Olympia especially could see some big impacts from climate change if sea levels rise. I mean, downtown is like 6 inches above sea level as it is. However, anyone listening to this podcast has probably noticed in the discourse how environmental protection measures are often presented as being at odds with the goal of creating or preserving, well-paid jobs. As socialists, we have an opportunity to overcome this false dichotomy and show that these two goals can be aligned through, Green New Deal type legislation. As a representative, what would you have gone about doing sort of to gain public support for these kind of things, especially getting labor unions behind them, maybe convincing other legislators who might be more reticent about, big public investments?
Well, I mean, we're at a point where we're way overdue as far as transitioning to a green economy. It's got to be done. And the state sector, public sector needs to lead the way with the transition. So, we can have a state level Green New Deal. If we can't get one at the federal level, I would encourage public power. We need to do massive home renovations for energy efficiency. We can do all kinds of things, including, like a 4-day work week. So people are, we can give them more time off rather than, working all the time and creating larger carbon footprint by all the commutes that people do. So we encourage people working from home. There's a lot of things to do. Even in Thurston County, we're way behind on as far as reaching our climate goals. And I definitely work on all policies. I would work with organizations that I'm accountable to. I'd be working with DSA on what we should do as far as policy-wise on a whole range of topics. In fact, I think if I did win, I'd want to have, if we get a socialist elected, to have a socialist in office committee so people can be involved and keep the candidate, the elected official, accountable. that's what needs to be done. So those are a few ideas.
Yeah, with the green economy thing, it's just, there has to be public investment. Right. I mean, the energy companies that exist now, it's like they could do it. Like they could build the infrastructure and they could stand to profit from it. But it's just the focus is so narrowly on extremely short-term profit that they won't do it even if they could make a ton of money down the road, because just sinking the infrastructure investment would cut into the, investor payouts right now. And it's like, it's a real reveal of how truly psychotic the economy that we have now is. It's like you could even still make a ton of money down the road that you won't do it because so there has to be public investment. I think for one thing, we should close all the just gaping tax loopholes that we have in this state for big companies that didn't even keep jobs here.
Right.
And then we should make these public investments, and I think just have this stipulation that they have to pay a certain wage, and that for example, any employer who's getting a state contract for this infrastructure work has to pledge to not contest a unionization effort by the workers. It's like, you just won't. You'll just do card check or whatever. You know what I mean? So I wanted to ask about crime. So there was no Republican running in this race. So, even if you had to have a bunch of debates, you probably wouldn't have gotten trolled by, some right winger about being soft on crime the way they love to do. But I'm still sort of curious what your thoughts are on that one. I mean, having worked in retail and been in a retail, union, concerns about crime, do come up frequently among workers, whether, that's out of a legitimate concern for their own safety, or if maybe people sort of misguidedly identify the employer's interests with their own. We know that the right loves to whip up this hysteria over crime and exaggerate it, but there are, real concerns here that the left can't ignore. I was sort of curious, how do you think that we as a movement can shift the narrative on this issue and sort of convince working class voters that what we really need is social programs, social democratic efforts can do much more to prevent crime than police and prisons, right? I mean, how do you see a campaign, our electoral campaigns fitting into that effort?
Yeah, I think a lot of times crime is people who are desperate, economically desperate, and because they feel like they're not employable or they're not making enough money, and they turn to crime because the system isn't working for them. So if we have, basic services as a guarantee, whether, or basic income, more of to guarantee housing, to guarantee, healthcare, things like that, I think that will go a huge way, a long way toward reducing crime significantly. I think we need to invest less in criminal justice and prisons and police, and invest much more in social services, social housing, universal health care. And, I was endorsed by the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. I think we need to make sure that the police are held accountable for killings and violence against people. So people, I'm not saying that people shouldn't be worried about crime, but the way that we've been approaching it for forever is the wrong way to do it. It's just punitive, doesn't get at the root. Because if we got at the root, then we might, shave away a little bit of profit from some people. But,
right,
for the long-term health of the whole society, we've got to address the root problems, root causes.
Right, like, yes, I agree that theft is bad, and there is no bigger theft in society than the theft of value from the workers by capitalists, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's like, there's some of that you can work with, but I mean, I think at the policy level, right, as you said, I mean, police and prisons take up more of, local level budgets than they ever have. Right, and yet we still have this crime, which might suggest that what we've been doing is not working.
Yeah.
Right. We might, and I think, that there was some messaging problems perhaps with the defund the police thing when that came out, because I think that there wasn't, it wasn't as much talking maybe about what else we could be doing that would, and so I think some people wrongly took that as like, oh, these are just lefties who don't like cops, and if we defund the police, there'll be no one to protect us from all this crime that's happening or whatever, when I think we could be making a more cogent argument about it. It's like, think about how much more, crime would be prevented if we spent that money on things that will sort of stop, things upstream. Because you're right. I mean, it's like people who are desperate, the strains that capitalism puts people under create these mental health and addiction problems that people then can't have regular jobs, and so they resort to crime. And it's like, we could just dial back the brutality a little bit, and you could probably actually, because it's like, geez, you don't hear about Sweden having this much of a problem, right? I mean, anyway, that was just yesterday. So on the front of labor and sort of policy related to labor, so the labor movement in Washington can claim some good victories in the last legislative session. As we talked about in previous episode of the show, a bill was passed which would ensure greater job security for grocery workers in the event of a merger between large employers. And a lot of labor endorsed candidates did win big in Washington this November, at least at the state level. However, some labor priorities did not pass in the last session. A bill which would have given striking workers access to unemployment insurance didn't even make it to a floor vote, which was very disappointing, because that legislation would have given significantly greater leverage to workers in labor disputes. Why did this bill meet a premature end, do you think? And going forward, what sort of laws do you think we could pass at the state level to increase workers' power, protect or expand the right to organize? I think this is, especially important given that, Trump will be appointing his own people to the National Labor Relations Board, which means at the federal level, there's going to be less interest in enforcing, workers' rights in these disputes with employers.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that was a huge disappointment to have a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, a Democratic governor, and not get, unemployment benefits passed for striking workers. The reason why is because I think the Democratic Party kind of has one foot in each camp. They don't want to it's like I was a candidate who's like, which side are you on? I'm on Labor's side. And I made that very clear. And like you said, just the way capitalism works is it's a theft. By skimming off surplus value from workers and paying them less than the value that they create. Capitalism is theft from workers. And I think we need to keep that forefront in our minds so we can, transition out of the system that we have now into something that's going to solve those problems. So that's why I think the Democrats won't go as far as we would like them to go, is because they feel like they have to placate business class, because, even putting a wealth tax on the ultra rich, people were afraid to do that. And I think because maybe some of them actually admire those people, and other people are terrified of them because they don't want all that money to be used to campaign against them. But which side are you on? You got to pick a side. If we're going to make progress, then you got to pick a side.
Yeah, wasn't it Jesus who said a man cannot serve two masters? Abraham Lincoln with the house divided cannot stand.
Yep.
Insert other cliche quote here. It is, it is wild though. I mean, and we're all living with the consequences of it. That at least at the national level, the Democrats seem to have just really drunk that Kool-Aid that like incredibly rich people's feelings are the only legitimate measure of like how the economy is doing. It's baffling, but. On that note, I'm just curious for kind of our last segment here, what your thoughts are as far as what are the urgent tasks of our movement. Here, to use another cliche quote, here at the local level as Olympia DSA. I mean, in terms of our labor work, our electoral work, any other kinds of organizing, what you see as our major like opportunities and obstacles going forward.
Well, I think, the non-reformist reforms are important. Like, just to make sure that we don't get stuck into just trying to make, we're going to raise the minimum wage a little bit or even significantly, and then losing the focus of our long-term goal. Our long-term goal is to bring socialism and get rid of capitalism, which sometimes seems like, wow, that feels like it's out of reach sometimes, especially right after Trump gets elected. But we need to make the reforms, get things out of the economy that are commodities and make them rights. So like having universal health care, things like that. And not lose our long-term focus. And this is that. I mean, that question you asked is such a huge question.
Yeah, sorry.
But it's something that all chapters need to discuss, and that's just something that's important to me, and I hope it's important to other people too.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is a moment of both challenge and opportunity, right? I mean, we're going to be dealing with a federal government that is like way more hostile even than the Democrats have been to any kind of, progressive reform, doing any kind of social democratic policies. But at the same time, I think people's disappointment in the Democrats' apparent inability to carry, to be champions of their interests may increase interest in, or may increase people's appetites for real, like, political alternatives. And I think it's up to us to, I think we need to get as good as the right has been at taking advantage of a crisis and coming out ahead because of it, because they're certainly very good at that. But that means, we have to reach people. We have to convince them that there's a real alternative, and we have to convince them also that it's going to take them, right? I think that's the hardest part. I think, people in this country have gotten very accustomed to feeling powerless, and that whether they're on the right or the center or even on the left to some degree, they kind of expect there will be a savior who can come along that they can vote for, but make some kind of, sort of token contribution to, and then they'll take care of it and everything will be fine. And I think that, we need to start convincing people that really the only savior you have is going to be us coming together, right? I mean, again, with Jesus and the look to your own salvation thing, right? It's like we have to convince people that it's going to take all of us coming together, and hopefully, if there's an upshot of this whole dreadful situation that we're in, it's that maybe people will be more willing to hear that, right? Like, politics is never over. I think that, there's that sort of liberal idea that politics is a thing that happens once in a while and then you can go back to your life. But the truth of the matter is, like, politics will never be over, right? I mean, even if we achieve socialism and get everything that we want or whatever, there's still going to be politics, right? There's still going to be questions to be settled. The work will never be entirely over. I think we need to accustom ourselves to that in some manner of speaking. But
yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Maybe that wasn't the encouraging thing people wanted to hear right now, but it is, it's true. And I think at a time like this, I mean, we also have to be considering really practical questions about, like, what is the most kind of effective work that we can be doing. I think we need to remember about, being pragmatic while not being, opportunistic, right? I mean, that's always an important distinction to remember. Are there any final thoughts that you wanted to share? I think I'm just doing philosophical rambling at this point.
Well, I just, appreciate the work that you're doing, and
I'm just talking.
Yeah, I mean, your podcast and the work that you've done with the chapter and helping the campaign. And if there is anyone out there listening who's considering running, I'd be happy to talk to them about what it might take and just some little, what I've learned. I'm not an expert, but I would be happy to help somebody if they are thinking about it.
Yeah, and I want to also thank you again for running. I saw the incredible amount of time and effort that you put into it, and it was really inspiring to see the kind of response that you got. I mean, I always thought that this was a good undertaking, and seeing what a good result you got in the polls, I think, like I said, I think that shows that the kind of politics that DSA is talking about, the kind of policies that we're talking about, revitalizing the labor movement, I think that all of that stuff resonates with people. We just have to be out there talking to people. We have to be out there organizing, showing that there's an alternative. We need to be going into workplaces, getting active with the unions if they're there, or, helping start unions if there isn't one. There's always that debate, although maybe it's looking closer to settled now, but there's always been that debate about, do we try to push the Democratic Party to the left, or do we try to build an independent working class party? I personally think that the answer really is with the latter, but we also have to pursue reforms to make the system more democratic, right? I mean, it's hard to break in, right? I mean, the system has been very well designed to keep, really popular movements from attaining power. But wherever you fall on that, a lot of the answers are the same, which is that, like, we just need independent working class power. We need stronger unions. We need a working class political movement of some kind.
Yeah. Either way, it's going to be a big undertaking. Whether we try and start a third party, or whether we try and bang our heads against the wall and try and make the Democrats, or even left Democratic Socialists under the Democratic Party ticket line. I think also it kind of depends on local conditions.
Right, yeah.
So I'm not going to just have one blanket statement about it. I think some place in New York conditions are different than running in Louisiana or someplace. I mean, it really depends. But either way, it's going to be a Herculean task to transform this country.
Yeah, and on the note, I mean, any debate about elections runs into, people worrying about the spoiler thing, and think it's like, well, we should also be pursuing, some kind of proportional voting system or something where you don't have to worry about that. I mean, a lot of other countries have done that, making it easier to have a political system that has, more than two parties, right? Where people aren't worried about, well, if I vote for who I really like, then the really bad guy will win. I mean, we really do need to work on that. And I've always been a little bit surprised that at the national level, DSA hasn't made a bigger deal out of reforming the electoral system. I mean, I know a lot of it at the federal level, a lot of that might even involve constitutional amendment, which, God help you when you're trying to do that. But I mean, at the state level, I think there's opportunities. I mean, America is weird in that way where it seems like every state runs its elections differently. And so there may be some opportunity there. I mean, geez, in a lot of, we're lucky in Washington where we have mail-in, but other states, it's like, nope, you got to show up at the polling place and your boss is not obligated to give you the day off. And so if it's, if you don't really see things improving for you either way, are you going to miss the day of pay to go and vote? So we need to be working on fixing that kind of stuff. We need to make it easier for people to get involved and have their voice heard at the same time that we are building a real viable alternative that can be a vehicle for those discontents that people have.
I think that's a really important point, Isaac, because reforming the electoral system. And I'm not just talking about getting rid of the electoral college or something. I'm talking about, mostly when I'm talking about campaigns, because of my own experience, it's more like local campaigns, legislative campaigns, city council campaigns. Talking about the presidential campaign is like a completely different universe. So, but we can do a lot reforming wise so we can get local candidates, DSA candidates elected.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Syd, thank you so much for everything. Thank you for your time. It was great talking with you today.
Thank you, Isaac. It's been a pleasure.
All right. And everyone out there listening, as always, solidarity forever.
Solidarity.